That's really weird. Thank you. Like, I don't know why it's not showing up for me. All right, it's just one of those days. Okay, public comment. Anybody have public comment? Okay, moving forward. Okay, now we get to the fun stuff. Oops, let me fix this screen. Oh my gosh, this is hilarious. Okay. And let me make sure that the chat is also showing up here. Sorry, just trying to make sure everybody in this room can view. There we go. All right. So just to catch everybody up on what we're doing and where we are. In April, we decided to create a materials development working group. So we have had a couple of meetings of that group, and the idea was really to develop what are going to be the key messages for our materials, right? So we're creating this sort of newish campaign to make sure that we are creating equity around making sure that everybody that needs homeless access to our services knows what they are, how to connect to them, and that the materials are culturally relevant and in the languages that people need. So we've been working with our communications team for health services with some guidance about like, how do you think about key messages? And so we in the working group have been kind of chewing on that. So we're bringing that here today, but I want to share with the group, let me just see. So CEI, Community Education and Information, is the communications team. They gave us an example of something that they helped, environmental health actually, so this building that we're in, one of the things they do is license food vendors. So they created a campaign and gave us as an example, sort of the goals of their messaging campaign and like some of their key messages for two different audiences. So that was a really great parallel for us. Like we kind of have two different audiences, right? We have people that are actually seeking services and then what we're calling amplifiers. And so I let me just see, actually, let me stop sharing and I'm gonna pull up the example just so that folks can really see. And this is all in the packet, but want to show you, we're gonna make this big and we're gonna make it bigger. Oh gosh, sorry. Hold on 1 second. So you can see, so the right is just sort of what we've been drafting for the equity plan, but you can see for this CART vendor communications plan, they have some very clear goals. So they want to provide outreach and education to vendors of like a very specific kind of CART about that they need permits. So basically like there's information that they need people to have specifically about what they want them to do. Then the second thing is sort of their big campaign is streamline and potentially incentivize the permitting process in ways that address language, cultural, and economic barriers. So that's where we kind of have the equity lens of like, particularly for this population that they're working with for vendors, many of them are Spanish speaking and maybe immigrants and may not know sort of about the whole process. Third is to encourage the public to patronize permitted CART vendors who sell healthy food. So making sure that people know this resource is there and that they to go through this particular channel, right? To look for permitted vendors versus non-permitted vendors. So in our group, I'm gonna pull up a different document. In our group, we started to work on in the materials development working group, and I'm going to make this bigger. Oh, hold on, this is not sharing. Sorry, guys. So what this group started to work on, and when I say this group, this materials development working group, coming up with a couple of key goals. So what we're bringing to this group to kind of fine tune and get close to final is like, what are we considering the sort of overarching goals of our communications campaign? And then we're going to get to those key messages and talk about the key messages we drafted for our work. with the idea that we're gonna get those pretty tight today so that we can then move forward. Keep it in, keep it, just make sure you're muted on there or it will cause wacky sound. And I just want to check in because it's been a couple months. So for anybody that was part of that materials development working group, you want to identify yourself and or say anything about that process broadly before we move into the talking about things. No pressure.
I mean, I believe was part of the group. I'm part of so many different groups.
I know, me too. I think you were.
Yes, but wasn't really prepared to give a snapshot.
No, it's fine. Just creating opportunity, no pressure. Anybody else that's remote that was part of either of the two materials development conversations that wants to say anything about it? Okay. And if you think of something later, we'll go for it. So one thing you'll note, we got some feedback in one of our sessions, and this is a bigger question that we actually need to take up with with our communications team. So we got feedback that like on the ground, people of Hispanic or Latin heritage are not identifying as Latinx. That's really like this sort of ivory tower term that's being used. So the recommendation and what we were using in that conversation was Latine. So if you see that and you're like, what is that? That's just feedback we got. We're gonna have to double check in to make sure we're congruent, sort of with bigger system stuff and check in on the ground when we do some focus groups. But so the number one goal, and I'm gonna pause for a minute. So the other thing is, and the thread I have to keep reminding myself is this work is happening under the umbrella of the equity of the Council on Homelessness. And part of why this group decided to focus on materials development and some of the data that shows us where a gap is around Latine folks, where we are not seeing people from this population accessing services at the rate that we would expect, given what we know around experiences of poverty and actually experiences of homelessness from other sources besides our actual service data. So our data is telling us this is an underserved, a population that's not using services. So we've decided to focus on this population specifically for the campaign. That doesn't mean those are all the people that are going to get the messaging, but we for sure need to have the lens that we are being culturally relevant and that we have things in languages of this population. So another thing that came up was around not just Spanish, but there are many immigrants in the Latino population that may actually be speaking indigenous languages or not actually even speaking Spanish, which was like a big aha in the last materials development group. So I think we need to do a little more digging with some of our health navigators to see that are more deeply, working more deeply in those communities on the ground. But big picture, provide outreach and education to Latino or indigenous populations about homeless or housing services. And what we want to accomplish is that they're increasing their knowledge of and access to services. So that's like the big goal. And there's a little bit about the reason. I'm just going to stop there. Lots of words coming out of my mouth. Do folks have thoughts, questions? I actually can take notes in this document if there's like things that we want to say or edit. Does that feel like a solid goal for this campaign?
It feels to me, this is Juno, it feels really solid to me, especially I am remembering more about the discussions we had in those meetings, and it was also pretty eye-opening to me as well. And also I would be interested in thinking about, we can have this focus, and then, we can also kind of look to implement sort of intersectional lens as well, and see where our populations might cross with the Latino population that we're focusing on. You know, my personal experiences had me leaning towards, well, you know, focusing just on Latino population is really good, and I think we should continue to do that. And also, you know, what about the intersectionality between queer people and
Yep.
Latina people? Because, and I'm sure that's a space that, you know, we may be able to provide the outreach and education to that people in that space with our plan already going on, but we might benefit from having those kind of discussions at the forefront alongside our main focus.
And I think that's a really good point, especially as we start to think about, part of what we're doing is like creating these materials, but then there's this whole other piece of dispersing them and through that whole network of amplifiers. So I agree, we want to like be testing this stuff too with different populations to see, you know, if all of our materials are showing Latina families with an identifiable man and a woman, like what does that mean for the queer population? How do we make sure we have all of those perspectives so that we're being inclusive, not exclusive in what we're showing? Yeah.
Exactly. And,
Jake,
oh, sorry.
no.
I'll wait my turn.
No, go ahead.
You know, it's kind of, you know, exactly, because like the next thought process there is like, well, if that's the case, and there are only those families with, you know, mostly those families that we see that are like, as you described, then, you know, my brain goes, well, it's not that there aren't, like, most likely, you know, families that like would be a different setup. It's just that like maybe we're not tracking them, or maybe they're getting slipped through the cracks, or maybe they don't feel comfortable like identifying themselves to utilize the services. And that then brings us back to our original point one of, well, then providing the outreach there is even more important, and educating that these services are for you. You can use them. You know, you will be seen and recognized. So I think that kind of captures what I was thinking.
Jamie Checker, I see your hand.
Yeah. So I apologize if this gets us into a rabbit hole, but I just want to flag for folks that our data tracking is going to look a little bit different in the near future. HUD has released new data standards where instead of tracking Hispanic, Latino, all of that as a separate ethnicity, they're now lumping it in as one race category, along with Middle Eastern and North African as a race option. So this is a good change. It reflects a lot of the community feedback we've received, not keeping things separate and forcing people to choose an identity that might not fit well with them. But it might make it challenging for us in the near future to do some comparative analysis. So I just want to flag all of that and make a note for future versions of us that if the data is challenging, it's going to be knowingly so, and we can try and think of ways to still get the information out.
That's important. Thanks, Jean. Yes, let's.
So that probably further complicates what I was going to offer, which is how will we know if our efforts are successful?
Mm-hmm.
And then for me, there's two aspects of that. If they're not successful, if we can't demonstrate through the data that they are successful, is it because our communication plan wasn't what it needed to be, or the actual services which people now know about need to make some changes in order to truly be accessible? Like, is it on the program operations, whatever would end?
Yep.
More or less than the communications end? So just a cautionary musing, I guess. So.
And I think that's a really important thing when we're thinking about having measurable outcomes. Like, we need to, exactly what you said, is we need to be able to tell it what we're doing all this work, like, is it working? So I think when we start to get more into the measurable, what we're going to measure, there may be some stuff that we're just not going to be able to know, but there may be some things that we can really drill down that may help tease some of that out. And maybe we end up doing surveys, like maybe there may be stuff we can do down the road to help with that. Yeah, Kiva.
This is Kiva. Yeah, we've had sort of that conversation before, because we are talking about expanding, tweaking our communications and our accessibility of this information to different communities. But we can't really get, in my opinion, I don't know that we can really get a true sense of whether these new communication forums or venues are working, because the system, until the system changes, we don't know if what we're doing is making a difference, or is it just, because we have that information now. We have the information in regard to our old way of our prior or previous way of communicating. We have the information as to how many people we serve, what the success rate is according to that former information and former venues of getting the information out. But that also may have been only directly affected, directly as a result of the system and not the communication, the communication forum or the way we got it out. So we may, it is really important for us to continue to tweak who we get the information out to, how we get the information out. But what's extraordinarily important to all of this is that the system does something to change, does something to foment a difference in how we get the information, how the information looks. Because if the system stays the same, then we're just going to get more information, more of the same information, right? Only this time it might not be the Black community that says we're not accessing the system because it's not reliable. It may be the Latin community saying we're not accessing the system because it's not reliable, right? And so then, and that's one of the good things about this, that we are expanding and we are putting the information out in different ways. So that will give us a clue as to whether the system is really, it really is a system or not, or is it the communication, the way we're getting the information out. You get what I'm saying? I just want to make sure. Make sure it makes sense outside of our head. But yeah. So what's really important is that this is a concerted effort, that we don't just think about equity from the standpoint of how we get the information out, who we get the information to, who is available to get the information out for us, such as the amplifiers, but how the system is working. Because truthfully, equity and inclusion it starts with communication. That system thing is really the biggest part.
Yeah.
It really is. And if the system is set up for systemic racism, it's still going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're speaking to, Kiva, is one of the reasons, like, this whole thing is so big. And I think that's one of the reasons why we set a work plan in the beginning, where we were like, we know there are like a whole bunch of factors that go into a whole bunch of things. Our lane this year is communication, but I will say, and Jamie Schechter, I'm just gonna tag you maybe for comment around like the other committees and places in our system that are looking at the systems issues. So not necessarily strictly through an equity lens, and that is something that I think this group will continue to push. But there are like other pieces like the PATH committee and groups that are working on some of those systems pieces to figure out where things are not great, but not necessarily with an equity lens. And maybe that's something we figure out for a year too, is like, how do we build that? Yeah. Rachel, I see your hand up.
Thanks. So I was just thinking more about the outcomes and the metrics, you know, how to measure success piece of it. And I feel like we haven't, I've been to most, I think I've been to most, if not all of the materials development meetings. And I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I'll be really embarrassed if I am, I don't think we've talked about that piece.
We haven't in that group.
Okay, because I'm thinking that will impact our messaging, because it's almost like a backward approach if we decide that we're going to, look at whether it's rapid rehousing or exits, exits to supportive housing or whatever kind of thing we're looking at to see if through our communications, the populations that we're targeting fare better, then I think that that would influence what we decide the content and shape of our messaging is. And so I'm just kind of putting it there. Maybe we talk about this now, or maybe we talk about it in our next materials development meeting group, but a way that does, I think at this point, try to determine with some degree of, I don't know, specificity that could be fluid at the same time, but determine how we're going to evaluate the success. Because also to Kiva's point, right, there's the communications and to what extent they can serve and influence and help guide success, but also there's the systemic pieces and there's the scarcity of resources in general. And so we're gonna probably come up against that too. But if we're able to kind of look at these different pieces in a way that really gives us the information about this particular campaign that we're spending a lot of time on, like, I think it would be really, really great to be able to do that. And I don't have the answer, like, of course, I don't have an answer of what those metrics might look like, but just wanted to say that I think that that is really important to start thinking about maybe more, I don't know, concertedly.
And we actually have some of those that we developed as part of our work plan way in the beginning. But I do think that is actually something we need to go back now that the train has sort of left the station and we're definitely more, it's not so theoretical anymore. I think that actually is a great idea for the next equity committee, is to like really start to talk about the metrics. Jamie. Oh.
And what I will say about this group is that we've got some really interesting baseline data that we can compare against in the surveys that we've sent out. Things I would be looking at around whether are we meeting success or not is whether we see an increase in people who feel comfortable explaining how to access services, people who know, where access points are, what they are. If we see change in those areas, I think that would help point us to, are we being successful in our goals around education and increasing awareness and comfortability of our partners and our amplifiers to support the folks that they're seeing that we might not be seeing in accessing that.
Juno?
So what I'm kind of going to understand a bit more is that like our main outcome we might want to track is how, if this information, if this outreach and education is being received, like being able to actually be digested by people or a person and receiving that sort of feedback. But there may be a separate outcome we also might want to track of, because Kiva said, so actually got me thinking about it. Somebody might receive this outreach and just still be so feel so unlike that they want to engage with the system because they feel any sort of way that the information will just like the outreach won't matter. Like like might say like why does this outreach matter at all to me when the system, I still don't trust the system. So maybe it's also worth like making sure to also mention somewhere in our plans there, it's probably in the work plan already, that we also track, try to track the outcomes of what am I trying to say? Those people that do create, like where those touch points in the system are created from that outreach, because that can also then further down the road help us decide when we are ready to focus primarily not on just doing the outreach education, but on getting creating more of those touch points, what works, like what was well received, and we can use some of the same strategies that we use here.
Does this capture what you're saying, about like amplifiers? So like when you talk about the touch points, is that also like kind of overcome amplifiers?
Yeah.
And which ones are the most used and trusted?
Both amplifiers, and also like if there are like those direct connections with like stakeholders, with people experiencing homelessness, like being able to see what it can be, the outreach and education can be received, it can be well received, but what then was well received in a way that when it made a person or people or family want to pursue accessing those resources. Because we can then take that data, see what worked really well, what worked well, what didn't work, what really worked, and then bring that to future discussions about, well, now our focus is on improving those touch points directly instead of just doing outreach and education. What worked well in the previous time that we did this.
Yes,
I agree, and I think to simplify what one of my points too is that we can paint the car beautiful red and attract so many people who want to ride the car, but then when we open the door and they get in, either the car's not driving, and so are we, or it's smoking, you get what I'm saying? So are we, at this point, are we inviting more people? And it's something to think about. Are we inviting more people to access a service that doesn't work? And in effect, inviting more people to mistrust the
Yeah.
service in the future. So that's my whole point.
Yeah.
Because it's good to fix it on the outside, but you gotta fix it on the inside too, so that you get real data about how it's really, how the service itself is really going to help someone. Yes, it's excellent to know what attracts people, what people are attracted to the service, what people are, what points, where they can get information about. That's all really, really good. But are we creating another generation, if you want to call it that, of people who are going to mistrust the system? Because now there are more people attracted and more people accessing, and they're going to get the same type of.
Yeah. So actually, that is a perfect segue to number 2, which is like the second sort of key message, or I'm sorry, the second goal was really about making sure that we're addressing common questions and fears and helping set reasonable expectations. So we're not like, call CORE and you're going to get housed. So you'll see when we get into the messages, it's like setting some realistic expectations about, like, it might take time or there might not be resource available, but this is the way to start that process. For exactly that reason, because I think there is a lot of misinformation about what's available or what to expect. And so then people are mad and frustrated because it's not matching the expectations that they've developed. Alex, I see your hand.
Yes, I think that's awesome. We get a lot of clients who come to us thinking that we have housing just open and waiting, and they'll be able to move in the next day. And I'm not saying that hasn't been communicated to them prior, but I think I agree with you. It does segue, and I just really appreciate the last 3 comments. I think it was Kiva, Juno, and Rachel, I think, around, like, what does the data show? Because, client surveys is one piece of data, and then client outcomes is another piece of data, right? So there's that expectation around, what will I be able to get, and how quickly will I be able to get it? Would we be able to say, oh, in rapid housing programs we've seen across the COC that the average time to move in is 115 days, right? And I think also getting to, I think, what Kiva was saying too, around, what system we're bringing them into and what are the outcomes. I mean, I'm a provider and I can't tell you what our outcomes are, and if you're Latinx or African American, if you have a better or worse chance than whites than being housed successfully. And then my last piece around that too, in terms of reasonable expectations, we've asked the red team to add some more fields in HMIS, because we really want to get down to, the HUD expectation of what % of income is going towards rent, right? Because we're seeing the studies come out. If it's 70% or above, you're going to be homeless again. And so, that's another thing too that we've dealt with clients in the program. Sometimes they'll come in and they'll think, okay, you're paying a subsidy, so I'm just going to ride that subsidy. It's like, well, right, but in this kind of program, it's designed for you to get your income to take over the rent. And that's been a real issue for us sometimes. Sometimes because of the client's willingness or ability, and then also because of systemic racism. Once they get out and try to get a high-paying job, right? They're not able to get it. So Anyway, those three sort of data points I think are really important to see and then share to help people understand the current realities. And I would say, like on Kiva's thing, like, okay, the car, you think you're going to step into a Porsche. It's my grandma's Volvo that we're actually riding in. So, set your expectations. So yeah, period. Thank you.
Absolutely. So one thing I wanted to highlight too in the group discussions was around specifically if we're gonna focus on Latina population, making sure that we somehow are including or addressing common concerns that we've heard from our stakeholders and amplifiers around documentation, right? So concerns about like if they're undocumented, like what does that mean if you're touching our system? Maybe cultural factors that might inhibit seeking help outside of a social or family network. And then language access. So we talked about like, okay, great. So we have everything in Spanish. People A might not be able to read, or B, Spanish might not actually be the primary language. So just making sure that we're looking at that as we go through. The third goal is just encouraging amplifiers to share, like once we develop all this stuff, making sure that it is getting out through all the channels, because we're not it, right? We are not the end all be all. So making sure that we have built this very robust network and that people are getting materials out. And as they're getting feedback about them, about things, that we are not just putting information out, but that we're building these relationships so that we can, get information out, but also really get the information back that we need about how things are going. And whether or not the materials are meeting needs, but also like what's the experience of the system. Yeah, Kiva.
That's a really great point. Is when I was talking to my daughter, she's coordinator of a new program in Houston, Texas. And she was saying that she's going to put some written material together. And as she was saying that, I was thinking, people who are stressed, people who are in crisis, don't read. When I was in crisis, when I was about to be evicted and hungry, I was not reading, right? And so, yes, it's extraordinarily important to get written information out for anything other than to cover your behind, right? So we got the information to you, but that relationship building part is extraordinarily important, because when they can't hear and when they can't see or they can't process what's on the paper, hearing it might make a big difference. But on top of that, we have to remember that perception is not going to change. Perception is extraordinarily important when you're in crisis. Okay, so when you're in crisis, perception is important. And if I'm in crisis of homelessness and I call the homeless line and they tell me it's going to take 210 days for you to get, I'm not hearing that. What I'm hearing is I'm at home right now, right? And so it's going to take relationship, and it's going to take more than one time to hear that. Do you get what I'm saying? So that has to be considered when we're talking about that next generation, like I was saying. And I'm not talking about generation as people. I mean, the next generation of people who are going to mistrust the system. Because when I'm in crisis and I hear you say 210 days, that might immediately make me mistrust. I'm in crisis now, and you're telling me it's going to take a half a year for me to get a place to live, and I got 3 little kids, right? So that's another nuance that we have to consider.
Alex, your hand up, new or old?
You're on mute.
Okay, it's old. Got it. No problem. Leslie.
So Leslie's this third point made me think the subtext is our group of amplifiers. We need to really think of them not just as tools in our kit bag to get the info out, but as partners to our system of care as well, that we're caring and feeding for our amplifiers so that they are giving us feedback and dispensing the right information, and then feedback again, and then so that we're not just like, oh, once a year we send something out to you and we're done with you. But we really start to envision them as part of our system of care.
Which encompasses relationship. Yeah.
So maybe, you know, when we talk about this kind of a little sidetrack, but you know, when we have talked in the past about providers going and visiting other providers and seeing boots on the ground, what it looks like. If we ever do anything like that, let's include some of these amplifiers too, so they even know what they're telling people about. When you walk into Trinity Center, this is what I saw, you know, so you have a baseline, so.
Okay, so do folks feel comfortable with sort of these three overarching goals for what we're trying to accomplish? Like, why are we doing this work? Okay, so I want to move to some of the key messages that we started to come up with in our group, in the materials development working group. So the way it's organized is, number one is sort of like our first, what are we trying to do? We're trying to cue our audience, we're trying to make sure that we're catching the attention of somebody who is struggling with housing. So there's a bunch of different ways that we could say it. So those are all the options underneath. The second thing, the second sort of key message is like what action we want them to take. So again, we came up with a bunch of different varieties on that. The third key message was sort of setting the expectation about what would happen once somebody contacts the system. The fourth, so the third is sort of like, what can you expect sort of in your interactions, or what will actually literally happen when you call or when you walk in or interact with support. And then the fourth one is like expectations around the length of time. The fifth idea was like making sure that we convey that there actually is hope, because 3 and 4 can potentially be really disheartening. So trying to like balance some way. So I just want to spend a little time with this group, especially. So we had 2 different sessions where we worked on these and came up with possible wording. And my idea is that we come up with maybe like 2 or 3 of our favorite choices for wording for each of these. And then we are going to take those out and do some field testing, right? So we have like a focus group with people who would be the targets of these messages and say like, okay, how are these landing for you? Which of these results resonates best with you? So instead of being like, here's 8 choices for us now, we're at a point where we can really narrow down, like, what are the maybe 2 or 3 for each of these ideas? How would we best want to say that to achieve the goals that we have set out? And I just want to make sure, okay, James, get right back. So I think first I just want to check in, do folks feel like these are the right things that we want to go for in those orange buckets, right? So like cueing our audience, and there's a lot of discussion about how do we cue exactly who we're talking to. So I've gotten a lot of feedback around like, I don't want to hear the word homeless. That is not how I think of myself. So, okay, knowing that, how are we going to convey enough so that it's not just like, are you looking for a car loan? Like, do you need help? Well, yeah, I need help with like 9 million things. Which thing are you trying to help me with? Also conveying maybe in that initial message, the cueing Latina folks also. So like, that's the first one, is how do we want to cue our audience? So I numbered these so we can talk about like, are there ones that people are definitely like, nope, I don't like, or yes, I like, and or let's tweak a little bit. Is it helpful if I read them out loud, or do folks yeah,
Just some initial thoughts.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe not in this exact wording, but I really like number 8. I think that's the idea of number 8. You know, I've been thinking about this a lot in my own experiences recently, and I know I've also, part of that is I've heard that sort of those thoughts being reflected by Wayne as well in recent discussions, and it's like, yeah, like I only know now, as somebody who's kind of like intimately knowing how like the system works in a way that I never could have before when I was homeless, that like, wow, I was homeless for a lot longer than I actually thought. Like, you know, I could have, I maybe didn't want to see myself in that way because of, you know, social stigma, but at the same time, like, I just didn't realize that the situations I was in meant I was homeless. Like, And so I really like number 8. I think that like that kind of message would make me think, and be like, okay, like I think this probably applies to me, even though I thought none of these services were for me. Like I didn't, they were for everybody else but me, or like, were for misinformation, like they were for groups that like other groups or whatever, like was this for me? And like I can't access the services because I do, because of my experiences. So yeah, I like number 8. And I guess tied to that, I was thinking about this a bit before this meeting and stuff, and I don't think I like the language in 1, 2, and 3, because like, yes, this is true. Everyone deserves help with housing. Everyone deserves housing. And also there's like huge subtext there. That's like, everyone deserves housing as long as you meet the like federal definition of homelessness, or, any of those like subtext areas. And so it's like that I feel a little bit like, off about that, especially because it could lead to that situation where you're like, wow, this would be great. And then you're told, well, you don't meet the definition, so yeah. And to what that mistrust that Kiva was talking about earlier, where like even somebody who might be like, okay, I'm ready to try this, even though I mistrust, and then told, okay, actually, try again later. Yeah.
Great. Kiva.
So I have some thoughts.
Yeah.
Number 7, you're not alone. Don't get it. Especially specifically for housing. And I figure maybe some people might, but that could be great.
Yeah.
Right. Number 5 makes it feel like we're only talking to the undocumented population. We're only talking to that native population. And we know statistically that Black people are right. And so I'm gonna tell you right now, Black people are not gonna, they're like, okay, that's what I'm talking about. Right. I don't like 4 because I don't like the word struggle. I just don't like that word struggling.
You're not the only one.
It is an action word, but I just feel like that feels, it's a gut thing for me, and I think it would be a gut thing for other people struggling, right? And then it says there may be help for you. That may is a big question. Okay, you're
That's
saying.
exactly my point.
Right, yeah.
Maybe.
Maybe
not.
Right,
Yeah.
right, maybe not, right, so, I mean, I have some other thoughts about the other things, but I like 9. I like 9, everyone, and we could put that everyone in all caps. Everyone deserves a roof over their head, right? And that, if we put it in all caps, that shows me that that's not exclusionary, right? If you put it, that means everybody. It doesn't matter who you are, right? So I like number 9.
Rachel, I see your hand.
Yeah, I agree with what Jamie S said in the chat, and with broadly pretty much everything that was, what most of what people are saying. The other one that I wanted to kind of flag, I guess for the same reasons, that number 6 needs somewhere to stay, because we don't necessarily have a place for them to stay. And even then, it's not certain how long, even if they were temporarily housed, how long they would be able to stay. It just feels like when you say stay, it feels permanent. And also like there's a discrete offer there, and I don't feel like there is necessarily. So I just feel like it engenders, again, like false hopes and false expectations. And yeah.
Interesting balance to like kind of think about, because like we want to be very genuine about the reality of the situation. At the same time, you don't want to just tell people you won't be like this is very unlikely you'll get service, you know, so yeah, there is a very interesting balance to think about there.
Mhm. Jamie, I see your hand. You're muted.
I am struggling, I think maybe like some other folks, with the how do we balance the making sure people know things are out there that exist to help and not setting false expectations. And so maybe I need to like readjust my perspective of what is this material going to direct people to do, right? This is their first kind of gateway. It's going to send them to a care center, it's going to send them to CORE, or it's going to send them to 211, or our amplifiers are going to be there to be able to support kind of their engagement with the system. And so maybe we do need to go a little bit broader. This is the first intro. Maybe it is something like we can help you access resources, or we can help see if you can maintain or get housing in the community, something that can talk to what we can do in some cases. And then exactly, we work with our staff at those places to really give them talking points, let them know how to set the expectations of folks coming in. I think a lot of them do a good job of that now, so we're probably learning from them as well of how to achieve success with that. But I also don't want to discourage people right off the bat. So I'm kind of waffling back and forth a little bit.
So Jamie, let's actually go, I'm glad you said that. Let's go through and see what the direction, like what we're directing people to do, because it does speak to some of what you said. And Kiva, to come back to your struggle with the word may, so maybe not struggle, feelings about the word may. We talked a lot about this in the materials development group of how do we convey that like none of this is guaranteed. A lot of conversation about like the word may or start or option. So you'll see, okay, so in these actions to take, basically what we want them to do, and we kind of narrowed it down actually between right now, the key message is call, care, and CORE. There's 3 points of access, right? Those are the things you can get, but the actual action, there are just 2 actions. One action is to call 211, and there's 2 choices within that. And the other is physically go to a care center. So when we were crafting these, we've actually like, what is the actual action that we want them to take? And so this is where you kind of see where we're like, call 211 or go to a care center. And then what? To start a conversation, to learn more about your options, to find out what your options are, to learn what your options are. We may be able to help. This is the first step to convey like there's the thing we want you to do is this first piece. And then we talk a little bit more, you'll see sort of like, okay, and then what? But are we agreed that the action, like let's first figure out if we're agreed about what the action is we want them to take. Is it calling 211 and going to a care center?
I agree. This is Kiva.
Uh-huh.
I agree. Going back to what you were saying, people want to know that you're being genuine. And Jamie, you said it's not about what we can't do, but what we can do. But the truth is, it's not about what we can or can't do. It's about what we have for you and what we don't have for you. So maybe we need to think about saying, we have resources, or we have, because we do, we have resources for you. That's real. We can be genuine about that. We can't make any promises about what those resources are going to do, but we can promise you that we have a resource. And that's real, that's genuine, that's honest. I was taking that back to the other question, number 1. But that's an honest and genuine thing that we can say with integrity, right?
Mhm.
Because when you interact with someone with integrity, you're going to be genuine, you're going to be honest, and then the human to human is going to understand you're genuine and honest. And in regards to the action that we're going to take, you said it. The first step is, these are the first steps. And I think I just read that number 6 says it. Calling 211 or going to a care center is the first step. Right? We have this resource for you. This is the first step that you can take to use the resource that we have. That's genuine, it's real, it's honest, it doesn't imply expectation at that point.
So let me just show you what this next one says, and then we can talk about both these together. So then the next thing is like, okay, so you do those two things, and then what happens? So the different options that we came up with was staff will ask you questions to find the best options. Staff will ask you questions to better understand your needs. Your immigration status does not matter. Your immigration status is not a barrier to help. Immigrants welcome. Immigration status is not a factor in getting help. Undocumented, that's okay. So there's a couple like things that are smushed into this one. But the first two, I think, convey like ideally, there's a conversation that's gonna happen. So you're not just gonna like call up and get offered housing. There's gonna be a conversation about what's going on for you, what your needs are, what the options are. This was where we were like hedging is not really the right language, but trying to be careful about not overpromising. And that the part of the process is a conversation to figure out what your needs are and what's available, or what's the best fit for. And so I don't know exactly what that sounds like, but yeah, Juno.
And I think because we're looking at kind of centering this further discussion on this stuff around, deciding between a few different of these. I think that like there's some room, particularly like I'm thinking combining 7, with another option. So like 7 with 1, for example. And like, especially with when it comes to undocumented, because that can mean different things to a whole bunch of different people. Like, maybe a person may need to have their birth certificate
Right.
to be able to pursue work
Yes.
that they need to pay for their rents, which, would attract more population.
Yes.
And, combining that with, a question, combining that with like undocumented, that's okay, or some form of that with staff will ask you questions to find the best options for you. It's like, I feel like something around those lines would be good. And I know it's just like one of like a whole bunch of options we're gonna end up trying to focus on, but maybe keeping that sort of idea and these setting expectations, like, yeah.
I never ever thought about the term undocumented to mean anything more than like immigration status, but duh, of course. That's, yes, thank you.
This is Kiva,
Yeah.
and Juno took the words right out of my mouth. Because my next comment was gonna be, why can we not combine number 1 with number 7?
Mhm.
I don't see the reason why we couldn't.
Okay, so what that might look like is staff will, staff will ask you questions, and we like this language around like best options. Okay, so I'm just gonna create number 8, which combines these two things. And that can be totally, Fred, sorry, just kidding.
And to my previous point, we're being completely honest, and we're giving enough information to let everybody know that you're included.
Can we say? So this gets, so I have a question. Does documentation status, that feels like a very formal term. It covers the sort of 2 populations who may be struggling with documents, but is that too technical?
I don't think so, because our immigrant population, and they refer to themselves as undocs, right? So they understand what undocumented means. So I don't think that it would be too technical and complicated.
Do you think that this would cue our folks?
I
around?
think part of me says it is exactly in line with what we have discussed our goals are, focusing on Latin communities and providing outreach and education there. And having the data we have about those communities. at the same time, I do feel like there could be some people who are turned off or kind of not receptive to that language. And it brings me back to thinking about, well, it might be the best case situation, maybe to have, and I think this is the plan, but correct me if I'm wrong, have like multiple of these set up where it's like, okay, even depending on the amplifier,
Yeah.
if we're creating sort of cues for amplifiers to, use and interacting, or if we end up, whatever route we end up going on presenting the materials.
Yes.
Like there could and probably should be multiple of these like lines that we end up using.
I think your point is so well taken, and I'm thinking about like what our health department and what the state did around COVID, where there was a similar look to all the materials and the messaging was basically the same, but they changed the language or the images to clearly target different subpopulations. So I think that's a really great point. So yeah, and that's something that we can work with CEI with, and then we can field test those. So maybe, one could just be general, one could be, yeah. But we're looking kind of at these two are sort of our favorites. Is that what I'm hearing? And what this second sentence looks like might be a little different depending on who we're targeting.
Yeah. I only hesitate.
Yeah.
Because the longer this, I'm telling you, people, when they're in crisis, they don't read.
Yeah.
The less they have to read, the better, because they're not going to, you can't even process it like that. And this is scientifically proven, your brain's not working, right? So that's why I was saying that number one, and because while one word is better than 7 words when it comes to getting attention. So yes, we want to ensure that we're being racially and ethnically sensitive, but we also want to make sure that we're ensuring people see what they need to see.
Yes, so I will remind you, and this is a great, thank you for bringing this up, because we haven't even talked about like the actual materials, what the cars are gonna look like, right, what we're building. But like, we're gonna have flyers and cards, but we're also gonna have videos. I can guarantee you we're gonna create videos. So it could be like, we're not gonna have this whole big sentence, like maybe it's just the first sentence and there's some visual cues on there around like immigration status or something. But in a video, like we could have somebody saying all these longer sentences. So this is not necessarily like the exact script that's gonna go on things, but it's sort of like the gist, and then we can work with the communications folks of like, how can we convey this in some verbal ways, but also maybe there's some non-verbal ways or visual ways that we can convey something. Because I agree with you, like I get stuck where I'm like, oh God, these messages are really long, and then I'm like, hold on, we're developing key messages, not copy, right? We're developing like our sort of big, what's our main point, but how we are gonna actually say that on print might look a little different, but this is kind of getting like the big picture. So I think that's super helpful. Yes,
I was
Leslie.
just gonna-
Yeah, go ahead.
For me, documentation, that whole documentation thing, it gets a little squishy because there's the documentation and status with respect to physically being in this nation, right? Whatever is the right language around that.
Yeah.
But then in our system of care, we also talk about document ready. So all of a sudden,
Yes.
documents do matter. And if you're not really living in our world, that would right away, I would think, confuse people.
Yeah.
Because the next thing we're gonna be talking about is getting you document ready. Wait a second, you said documentation doesn't matter. So I'm not sure where to go with that. I'm just observing that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Jamie. You have a thought?
I think that the key message here is that documentation is not a factor in getting help. Will help you get document ready, will help you get there. It's not saying documentation is not a factor in getting housing or in like living in society, but it's not a barrier to calling 211, accessing CORE, or walking into a care center.
Yeah, and I think it does get tricky, and this is where it's like, The other thing I'll say is, this is sort of our like very beginning, the front stuff we need to tell people. We are talking about frequently asked questions documents that are gonna say like, I can guarantee you, one of the frequently asked questions things is gonna be about like, I'm undocumented or I'm not, legally documented in this country, like, what does that mean for my housing? You can't access federal housing. We need to say that somewhere, but that is not like the front message, because that is like a problem way down the road, but it is a real thing. Or, as you said, like, if somebody's birth certificate doesn't match up with like some of their other documents because of gender identity, like, that's not an issue at the front door. It should never be an issue at the front door. It may be something that gets resolved in the process. So this actually then speaks to the second thing, right? This issue of time. So part of what we're trying to get to here is, and so getting help may take time. There's not enough money, shelter, and housing. People are here to help navigate this complicated system. Core and care centers are not crisis response services. Getting help may take time, but we're here to help. Right, so these are a little all over the place, but you can kind of get the gist is like, there's not enough resource and this might take a while, so we just want to make sure you know that. Which is why we follow up with like, and there's hope. But this one, I feel like kind of is the trickiest one that I was working with, of like, how do we say this without being just dead beginner?
Welcome to my world.
Yeah, right, exactly. So do folks have thoughts on
I have a thought.
Yeah, please.
So kind of going off what Jamie said earlier about, wanting to talk about what we can do. And
Yes.
like, I
And the
think,
resources we do have.
right, exactly. I think that like part of that might be basically something, and this is like really working rough draft,
Great.
but like, like the sooner, is like very much something that says like, the sooner you engage, the sooner that we can help.
Mhm.
Because then you're setting an expectation that yes, there is going to be a time period. There is an element of time here, but the sooner you start the process, the sooner that we can move forward through that. And yeah, that kind of captures what we can do as opposed to what we can't do, which may help capture more people.
Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah.
It also, the undertext there is prevention. The sooner you come in to address a developing
Mhm.
issue, the more options there are for help, so.
That's a really interesting point. We don't even have on there. So, yeah, so this kind of, actually, that to me is like another cue of around like making sure people come in sooner rather than later. And if there's like a way to combine one, like getting help may take time, get started now, or, but I don't know.
I still want that May.
I know.
That May is letting me know you don't really know. No, the May is letting me know you have the resource, but you don't really know what you're doing, right? I'm a very direct and pragmatic person, right? Not everybody is, but I am. I like the word will, because when you tell me, Kiva, this will take time, then first of all, you build credibility, right? You're not, the May, it sounds like you wishy-washy, but when you say this will take some time, you build credibility. And I'm more likely to trust what you say next. And that's true.
Getting help.
And time is relative. So what if, and I get it, that you saying, well, this may take time, but what if we able to get you the resource tomorrow? Between today and tomorrow is time.
Yes.
Thank you.
And also under promise and over.
Right.
Okay, so I see like getting help will take time.
With that change in language, I
Yeah.
really do like combining that with another one of these. I think, scroll up just for a
Yeah,
second.
let me make this a little smaller. There we go.
Like getting help will take time, and this is the reason why. Getting help, if we're gonna like focus on, explaining and sort of pointing out that like we want to set the expectations, and if we want to say like this is why we can't, this is why there's a time, we can offer these services, there will be this time, and this is why. You know, you could say, getting help will take time, there is not enough money, shelter, and housing. Like, that feels a lot more grounded to me than the may. And I know it's just a one-word difference, but it is that sort of like honesty. It's like, you know, when somebody sits me down and says like, this will take time, then I can prepare myself mentally instead of being like, well, hopefully I can be that like one exception where I can get housed tomorrow, you know, because I really need it, or, you know, in a week or whatever it may be. And just like kind of having that honesty and also explaining a little bit about why there is that, why we are being honest about it, because there's not enough money, shelter, and housing.
So do you feel like, so right now I have like getting help will take time, resources are limited.
Yes.
Does that feel okay, or do you want to say like, is there a different way you want to say it?
It could even be a because, you know, it could even be getting help will take time because resources
Yeah.
are limited. Because they're like, time is a resource as
Yeah.
well.
Yep.
And, you know, it's all connected. It's, you know, if we had unlimited resources, all this stuff could be done very quickly.
Right.
But we don't.
Jamie, SAC, your hand?
I think this conversation is really applicable to housing. Like, we know housing is going to take time, but I wouldn't want to discourage folks from thinking about the other services our system of care offers. They might be able to walk into GRIP today and get a hot meal and do their laundry. So like, that could be an immediate need that's addressed that could help them a little bit. They could be able to get connected to winter nights today. They could be able to do a few things kind of immediately. We can start today, right? I think that's kind of the thing I'd like to be driving towards. And housing stability might take time. Like, you're not getting an apartment today necessarily, but you could get something that'll help you get there.
This is Kiva. That sounds wonderful, Jamie. And so as you were saying that, I could hear saying something to the effect that of getting housing will take time, but we may have immediate resources for it, something like that, right? And so that we're telling them, we're setting an expectation at least for housing, and the resources may be available right now. That's awesome.
So I'm just drafting stuff, so like, housing or shelter may take longer. But like what are we saying? So I'm interested to say, like, what would we say is available now? And part of this is actually like a question for you, Leslie, and also for GRIP, like, do people get turned away because there's not enough capacity? Or, you know, part of what I'm trying to hedge with this also is like, CORE is not crisis response. They're not able to show up right away. So, because I appreciate your point, Jamie, of like, there are some things that we theoretically could offer them right now. And I think I'm especially thinking about this with like CORE and housing and shelter. Like, people call and they expect they will be able to get those things right away, and that is just not realistic. And so how do we say that? And what are the things that we can safely say? Do we want to say anything specific about what you get right now? Or we want to say, but some things may be available immediately?
I think like you may end up having multiple messages, and I am really partial towards explaining what we can do.
Yep.
And like, you know, I think it's really important what Jamie asked to find out earlier about, hey, yes, like these services you could receive these right now. And also, you know, housing may take longer. And I'm not sure exactly how to word all that yet, you know, the best way to say it, but I do think that it's like, I do see a benefit in focusing on what we can do. Even if that's to explain that, like, even if that's attached attached to something that we can't do. Like,
Mhm.
like we can offer these things, and also this thing might take longer. But just like, yeah, I do think that's a good place to continue with this, because it's, you know, something along the lines of, for number 3, for example, like, I'm not feeling like to attach the language and directly, but like, there is something we can offer. And it does, you know, the language is probably a bit too, like, the language is probably needs to be reworked a little bit, but it's like, this is what we can offer, and this is what, you know, this is why we offer this kind of thing. Like, people are here to help navigate, because this is a very complicated system. Yeah, so it brings me back to thinking like that we maybe should have multiple, sort of, like we mentioned earlier, Jamie, about like how the things were done with COVID, like having these multiple different forms of, like having this different form, what's the word I'm looking for? Different like presentations.
Yeah.
Yeah, different versions,
Mhm.
yeah, of that education and information, because some, even just a one sentence difference, even just one word changing may to will might affect some people more than others, or vice versa, or you might lose people, or you might gain people. And that might even be different in different areas with different amplifiers, like, yeah.
So,
The person in crisis doesn't want to hear May,
yeah,
even if it's like not good news.
yeah,
Like, will at least lets you set clear expectations, and you're like, I'm not wasting any of my emotional like spoons, I'm not wasting any of my emotional energy, like my financial stuff, on thinking there's something that's gonna happen here that's not gonna happen. And then alternatively, like May, for somebody who is like, maybe has a bit more of that time as a resource, you know, May could be more appealing. Because then they're thinking, well, I don't necessarily need this now, or maybe like, but it's still be good to know that it applies to me. I don't know, it's a little, it's hard to find a balance. I agree.
what do folks think about number 6? So some services will take time to access, but people are here to help.
I like that under the next one for hope, because the hope is that somebody's gonna be here to help me with this process, right? So that to me doesn't particularly speak to time, but it does speak to hope. It speaks to you being here to be with me, to support me through the process. So I'm not attached to it being on time.
I hadn't thought about it, you know, like one of the things we can offer is people. Like a person to talk to, and to like that connection is a resource. Because I keep thinking about like shelter and core and all these things, and like, yes, those are actual services, but this people, there are people that you can actually connect to right now. I hadn't thought about that as an immediate resource.
But you did, you're the one that came up with the word relationship. So you had thought about it, you just hadn't
Hadn't put it
put it in
thought
that
about it this
puzzle
way.
piece and that, yeah.
But in this, like, because I really appreciate the framing that you and JDS have around, like, what can we offer? Because I just keep thinking of like, like all the ways that I'm poking holes and all this stuff, but we can. So if they call 211, they will get a live person. That is for sure. If they walk into a care center during business hours, they will interact with a live person. Those are 2 things that we can be for sure. When core can see them is a question mark, all these other things, but there are people here to help. Okay, let's move to the next one and then come back and see if we can drill down. So the last one is there is hope. So part of what we talked about in the materials group was like creating, and I've been thinking about this independently, of like creating sort of a set of success stories, like really trying to tell the stories of success. And so having some sort of toolkit or some way to tell the stories of people that have actually come through the system and gotten help. So the idea is like, people are getting unstained housed, learn more here, people are getting help, find out more here. Like something about if people want to learn more, that there are success stories. And that would actually like not solve their immediate problem, but if they're like, this is totally hopeless, this might be a way to boost your morale. So that's another option, and that's kind of what the group came up with as like a fifth sort of key message for a whole campaign. Thoughts about that? Do we even want to have that as part of a key message for this?
I like having that as part of our message. I think it's important to have at least a little bit of hope. Like we can be honest, and also through that honesty, create the trust, create that trust in relationship. And then something that involves hope can be like much more well received. Because it doesn't feel like, oh, well, they're just saying that to say that, or whatever. Like it feels like, you create that trust, and it feels like, okay, like this, I understand the reality of the situation, resources are limited, this might take time. And also knowing that with all that knowledge, now I'm allowed to be like, okay, well, I hope this happens by XYZ, or I hope I'm able to get XYZ thing, but you have that information. So we won't get, we will get, what services apply to you, which ones they don't, and why they don't, or So I like having hope. I just don't know the best way to capture it.
Yeah. Jamie, I saw you unmute.
Yeah, I am curious at how much a success story is effective. Because I know a lot of times they're super effective for things like fundraising and community outreach and all of those things. But I wonder how much people in crisis see them and go, oh, that could be me. I wonder if that translates in that same kind of message, or if it could be alienating of like, oh, well, that person is, might have an in, or they did this and that, and it's totally different from me, and they're not here to serve. I wonder, do we bog ourselves down by like focusing on individual successes, or but that might be me overthinking it.
Yeah.
Leslie, so I think there is something in hearing from the process that someone went through, not necessarily the success story, but the process. Yeah, I had to fill out 20 applications, and the 21st finally hit, and then it took 6 years and all that, like the process, someone's real experience of the process. But speaking to, if we do go with success stories, even videos of people talking about their experience, that's where we need to make sure that it's not all white people, for
100%.
instance, that the
Oh, yeah.
videos are from, right?
Yes.
Because that would just
Got all this stuff.
corroborate
Yes. No, totally with you. Yep.
Yeah, I feel like that diversity is pretty important, especially because our focus is on Latinx, and also we don't want to lose, being able to provide this outreach and education to other populations as well.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, as like a person of color, if I see this media, or I see something and I see, only Latinx people featured in it, and also the main sort of the core message might be like, undocumented, like we have these services for you. That might then make me think that, okay, this is not for me, right? Even if it is.
Yeah.
So the diversity is very important. I know that was never really like a question, but I feel like that's probably one of the reasons why it's like important, just so that we continue to, capture everybody we're trying to.
I'm looking at time, we have about half an hour left. Just for transparency, my hope was that we would identify like a couple key ones we want to take and field test or take to our CEI team. And then eventually, like the next phase is like, we're gonna start actually drafting materials and start like, building some stuff. So I want to go back through these and see if we're agreed with kind of what the main ones are that we want to look at moving forward. So I've heard, Kiva, you definitely like this one. Are there other ones in, oh wait, actually, let me go back up to the first one. So queuing our audience. So Juno, you would really like this one. One question I had is feedback I've gotten from various folks. Oh, that's fine. Question around the word homeless. And do we want to ascribe that word to someone? Like basically you are homeless, you just don't think you are. Is there another way that we could say it that conveys this? I like this. You don't have to live on the street. It's like conveying there's a might not look the way you think. I think there was like a drafted, and I heard you about not struggling. Maybe like you don't have to be living on the street to get help with to need help with housing, to get help with housing.
Or like to access the services, because that is kind of what we're saying, right? We're saying like, you don't have to live on the streets to like meet this definition, which then allows us to give you like access to our resources.
Yeah.
And so like something that captures that with different language, because I do agree, it's for me, it would, I wasn't exactly ready even though I was homeless to understand that I was, and like I was doing everything I could to like kind of data capture, like kind of get you to avoid that, thinking about that. So it's something that like, but what we're trying to say is, yes, you don't have to live on the streets to receive access to our services type of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
True, except when you really do have to be literally homeless to access some of our programs.
Yeah,
So like,
right.
so then there's the gotcha
Yeah,
at the end, but
yeah.
the front door wide open,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But there's something about like there's prevention, there's especially for K, like there are a lot of things that they may qualify, like so
And honestly, HUD has a specific definition of homelessness. So we don't want to go there because I'm not going to tell somebody, according to HUD, I can't tell you that you are homeless if you are sleeping on somebody's sofa, because HUD says that's not true, right? And so I don't want to, having been in bureaucracy, don't want to shoot my own credibility by trying to define it as it really is, as opposed to HUD doing it. That's one of the reasons why I say it. That's one of the reasons why I like number 10, because it's wide open, right? And it doesn't say anything about homelessness, so we don't even have to define it, right? Everyone deserves a roof over your head. That means your roof, right? And so, and what that can mean is that can mean anything from shelters to permanent supportive housing to rapid rehousing. So we're number 10 is a little more wide open. I love what you're saying, because it is true. You don't have to live on the streets to be homeless, but according to HUD,
There's some programs.
for most
Yeah.
programs, for most programs.
Yeah.
and one challenge is we
Yeah.
can't give everyone a roof over their
But
head.
not for our
But-
showers.
But truth is, you're right. It's true. It's true. You don't have to be, because I was with a friend for a whole year. But I was living with her for a whole year. And then when she didn't pay her rent, then we all were homeless, right?
Mhm.
So, but the point, it's absolutely true, but we're also talking about the fact that this is a program that is mainly based on HUD's definition.
What if we say you don't have to live on the streets to need help, or
I like using the same language from Ken, like something along the lines of you don't have to live on the streets to deserve help. Uh,
I guess part of me worries that who are we centering in this conversation? We're with that kind of language, we're centering people who are sheltered.
Yeah.
And we know 70% of the folks that show up in our PIC count are unsheltered.
that's
So I want to make sure that people don't think that we're the front door to things that are services for folks who are, generally low income, who are heavily rent burdened. Yes, we can prevent homelessness with prevention services, but we're not necessarily the folks you call up to get signed up for Medi-Cal. That's not going to be our primary service. It's something we do along with housing, but if Medi-Cal's your main need, we want to call an EHSD or 211 getting routed differently. I want to make sure we target our message to what are we providing, and then who's going to be the groups that we want to make sure we're getting to most.
That's a really good point, Jamie.
Yeah.
Go back to the data. The data shows us 70% of the people. But what I'm curious about, right, is if we're thinking about Latina, what the data also shows is folks are, well, then I get into the rat's nest of like, a lot of folks are living like doubled and tripled and 8 levels up at home. I would say you're not homeless. So I think this is where like I don't have enough data about this population and what their living circumstances are and what kind, like.
Yeah, exactly. It's the whole idea of like even.
And what they're looking for.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, because if you're living on a couch, you might, you would be, in some cases, like for some programs, you would be considered like, you could receive some resources. However, you may not show up. You're not gonna, even if you manage to be a part of the PIC count, you're not gonna show up as, in that category. But like if you're, so I can totally see that it's like a little bit of like, where there would be a little bit of cloudiness in the data there.
I want to do a time check. So one of the things Jamie Schechter and I talked about is agenda development for these meetings. And like, it's kind of in the two of us, like off in our office, like, and that doesn't feel right. So we did build in a little bit of time at the end of this meeting to agenda plan for the next meeting, which is in July. And so I'm looking at how far we got here. I'm looking at the fact we haven't gotten to the definitions piece yet. So I want to ask this group, do you think there needs to be another materials development working group between this meeting and the July committee meeting? Or do we just finish this conversation that we're having now in July and move the definitions to July?
I think we probably, if it took us this long to like get through the chunks that we got through, I think that we probably want to do another material development working group, even if it's just going over what we've already talked about today, and like not even touching the second half of what we were going to get into. But I feel like there's a lot of further discussion that could be had, especially on kind of the specifics of the language. We were thinking very broad today about like, who and how to access things. But when it comes to like the specificities of like, well, would this actually work? I guess, like when it comes down to the nitty gritty, like words we're using, like I feel like that probably needs a little bit more discussion. And also, I couldn't help but think that like, myself, like I'm not a part of the Latin community, and like it would be really helpful So like be able to have that meeting where we can maybe have some people who are, so they could provide
Mhm.
input, because I can only theorize about what would work, and I can't remember the individual we had the last
Mhm.
meeting.
Addie. Mhm.
Yeah, and she was awesome. And I would love to have like.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
So sounds like we should have another materials development working group. Do outreach with Latina amplifiers and stakeholders for the July meeting. Okay. Also for the materials development group.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that was really powerful
Yeah.
having that there, because those discussions as well.
I have a question.
Yes.
With these statistics that we're seeing, how do we come up with the,
Hey, Pat.
how do
You
we
poor
come up
thing.
with the focus Latin, with these statistics? How do we come up with it?
How do we or how did we?
How did we?
Because, yes, good question. So this goes way back to the C4 Innovations Equity Assessment of our system of care. And they basically did a big analysis of our system and our data, and they essentially said, we're documenting a gap. That we think Latina folks are underutilizing the system given what we would expect. So that part is documented, and I can point you to the breadcrumbs
Okay,
for
that's
that.
fine.
Yeah. But it's like solidly documented in the equity system.
Okay.
Hello, Pat. You've had quite a day.
Quite a day. I started at Escobar
Oh, no.
and then
Oh, no.
ended up over at 1220 Diamond. That seems to take me to the Hilton. Yes.
10 minutes is better than no minutes.
Ah,
Poor thing. What we were discussing is, I think for the next steps, oh, good, thank you, Jamie. Jamie says data, so the 21, yep.
Yeah.
For the 2021 annual report, 19% of people accessing services for Latina, almost a quarter observed in the pit. And census data shows that our population in the county is approximately 25%. Thank you.
Question on that data, the pit count, did that
Sorry,
include
20.
sheltered and unsheltered?
Yeah, it's both. We're capturing just the the number. Mhm.
So for the July equity meeting, I think it sounds like we also need to discuss the measures, right? Like we've been talking about, like, okay, so what are the measures gonna look like? So we'll pull some stuff for that. And I think, finalize the key messages for people with lived experience, or I'm gonna say people with experience, meaning people seeking services and amplifiers. At the next meeting. Jamie, you were slated to talk about definitions. I'm gonna guess we don't really have enough time for that. How do you, what's your, oh, you're muted.
So what I'll ask this group is included in the packet of the slides. A couple of meetings ago, we talked about definitions that we want to use so that when we're talking as the Council on Homelessness, we're talking about race meaning the same thing. We're talking about race equity meaning the same thing, et cetera. And if y'all remember back to, I think it was our March meeting when we had that power outage, we started getting through them and talking about tweaks we wanted to make it more us. And so in the slide deck, there should be kind of the words that we're using as our vocabulary and definitions, and kind of how I incorporate the feedback throughout those sessions and from folks in the audience. So be sure to review those, hopefully in advance of next meeting, and we can take it to the next meeting to kind of talk through it and meet these goals to bring it to the full council and kind of adopt those working definitions so that we're speaking as one voice.
And part of why I'll just mention that this is relevant is, like, for example, we just had a really, really good training on equity. But one of the questions that came up was like, what definitions are we? They had theirs, other trainings have had their own. We don't have ours. So like it's they're not like wildly different, but it is useful to just like have a common. So, so your homework between now and July is to look through all these and just see if there's anything that any big edits that you have. So I will, send a message out to these committee members and folks that have been active in the past on the materials development working group. So that we can drill down a little further, tighten up some of those key messages with the goal that we'll bring back to this group like 2 or 3 for each of the categories. To agree on those to then hopefully finalize. That sounds.
When is the next meeting?
Our next meeting is July. Hold on.
You just showed it.
I
It said the
did just show
11th.
it, yes. Hold on, July, yep, July 11th from 2 to 4 in this room, I'm Boulevard.
In South Carolina.
Okay, so let's actually just real quickly check on that. So July 11th. No Eva. Can everybody else make July 11th?
I will be coming back the day before
Okay,
unless my trip out of town gets extended.
okay,
So could I join by Zoom?
yes.
As long as there's enough
We just need to have
physical
3
bodies,
physical
right?
people here. So
Okay.
Janae,
So
Okay,
if
I
it
will
comes
be
to
here
that.
physically.
Okay.
Okay, if we could update the address in the invite,
what does it say in the invite?
1220 Diamond.
That is the right. That's weird.
21.
Oh, it says 12:20.
Right,
Oh, okay, well, that's good to know. That's curious. Okay, well, that's a problem. I apologize.
I should be good for the, yeah, I should be good for that day. There's also an HRM HMIS policy.
Okay.
That day. So I'll already be here.
I can attend, I just won't be.
Okay.
Sushi buffet.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry, that's terrible. That had the wrong address. We're gonna fix that.
it's been a day.
I'm so sorry.
Well, now that you're over here, I actually highly recommend people check out the Restore. The Habitat for Humanity
Oh.
Restore is very cool.
Is it
Very
like
cool.
British?
No, you feel like you're in a regular furniture store. They've got everything laid out and what's the word? Arranged.
Uh-huh.
It's lovely. Yeah, I
Okay.
All right,
got nowhere else to go afterwards. I'd suggest checking it out.
all right. Thank you all for being here. Our work here is done for now. I'm gonna end the meeting.